what's really amazing about the women's response rooms is that while the ERRs maintain humanitarian neutrality, they're not political at all, and that's for obvious reasons and needs to be. They are bringing together women in southern Kordofan, in Gadaref, in Kassala, in Khartoum. People from different ethnic tribes have not met before, have never really talked, and they're talking to each other. They're actually forming these bonds and learning from each other. There's a constant sort of churning of learning. Like you'll get on a call with the ERRs and there'll be 300 or 800 people on a call talking about what happened in this place and what that means for another place. So the women's response rooms hold a lot of value, but the part of that value is also just the cross communication that's occurring, which is quite phenomenal.
Welcome to the St. Martin's Cloak podcast, where we go behind the headlines to focus on humans, not statistics. In today's episode, the first of what will be our long-running coverage on Sudan, we speak with Andrea Tracy, the director of the Mutual Aid program at Proximity to Humanity. Andrea has over 25 years of international humanitarian aid experience, and with her teammates at Proximity to Humanity and the Mutual Aid to Sudan Coalition, she is leading international support efforts to Sudanese grassroots aid. This is truly life-saving work. We hear from Andrea about the devastating impact of USAID cuts, both in Sudan and around the world, Sudan's grassroots emergency response rooms, and the local volunteers who lead them, the critical role of women's response rooms, led by Sudanese women on the ground, how Proximity to Humanity gets 95 cents of every dollar to aid efforts on the ground, and much more. But first, a quick introduction. Good morning, everyone. This is Andrew Loftusness recording from Istanbul.
Hi, everyone. This is Milos Majori recording from London. And Andrew, we are fresh off the bat with our interview with Andrea Tracy, in which we talked about the situation in Sudan. And this is a topic that we've really been wanting to talk about for a long time, but we wanted to make sure that we talked with someone who really knew what was going on, someone who really had the right experience to convey what was going on. We didn't just want it to be an explainer from our side with our analyses. And I think that Andrea really conveyed that during the interview.
Yeah, 100%. And Andrea, thank you again so much for your time. It was truly an honor to speak with you. So for listeners' awareness, Andrea is currently in South Sudan. She went there on an aid mission to measure the impact of aid cuts on the country and in the region. And then while she is there right now with an international team, there is an Ebola outbreak that initiated nearby in the DRC, in the Ituri province, which is on the border of both South Sudan and Uganda. That is a developing situation, and Andrea talks about it in the interview, so I'll let you listen to that. But we have linked a very recent New York Times article in the description of this episode explaining the situation there. And again, Andrea talks about this, but it's just another example of a devastating humanitarian emergency, which, due to aid cuts, the infrastructure to respond to it adequately in a way that can save lives is simply not in place. A couple of technical notes as well. We did have to use our backup audio for certain portions of the interview. We're recording from 3 very different places. Sometimes that happens, but we thank you for your patience on that one.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality. It's the nature of these interviews that we do. You know, sometimes the infrastructure, the connectivity levels aren't always, the standard that one would want. But the fact that we are able to get the message out there in whatever form is what is our end goal at the end of the day. And we hope that you can forgive the lack of quality that is made up with a wealth of expertise. And it should be said that Andrea has that. She's got over 2 decades of experience in the field, including with USAID. And this is something that we broached fairly early on in the interview, was the impact of the USAID cuts on the situation in Sudan, how devastating that was, and really exposing the degree in which US-funded humanitarian aid was ubiquitous at the time, and just suddenly removing it obviously has devastating impacts for people on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's a lot of both misinformation and outright disinformation out there about the impact of the destruction, essentially, of USAID. So I was very grateful that we were able to speak to a true ground expert on what that fallout actually looks like. And one of our goals with this show is to cover the long-term impact of aid cuts from the United States, and really that global trend of international aid cuts as well.
Which is something that, as you mentioned, has impacted places globally. I mean, we referenced it in our very first interview on Lebanon, how USAID affects, or rather the cuts to USAID affected the situation there even before the current conflict that's going on. But Sudan is one of those situations where, if you hear about it these days in the media, it's about how we don't hear enough about it. There's sort of news cycle irony going on, but needless to say that it's such a large topic with so many complexities and layers. At its core, it is a internal armed conflict between two opposing factions in the country. But below the surface, you've got international coalitions for the various groups, and it's simply too big for us to cover all in one episode. So we want to already put it on the radar that this is something that we are going to be talking about a lot, or our aim is to routinely cover Sudan in a comprehensive way, to keep the awareness up on the situation that is going on there. Not just on the ground, on the humanitarian sense, also trying to get a better sense of why we're here in the first place, but obviously continuing along our mission of highlighting efforts on the ground and how the situation is impacting the lives of people who are affected directly there.
Yeah, we are going to cover the war, and specifically the humanitarian impact of the war in Sudan, for as long as we have to. And our goal with that coverage, just like any other humanitarian crisis in the world that we have talked about or that we are going to talk about, is action, right? Is to point listeners in the direction of how they can actually help on the ground. And so, on that note, we are actively encouraging listeners, check out the links in the description to learn more and to donate to the Mutual Aid to Sudan Coalition. I'm a monthly donor myself, and I say that just to say, I truly do believe this is the most effective way right now for anyone in the world to help people that are literally saving lives every single day in Sudan. We have a few more links in the description, some very impactful articles from Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times that really help to elevate the work of the emergency response rooms to global recognition. We have a couple articles from the Council on Foreign Relations explaining the background of this war and how the humanitarian crisis has gotten to the catastrophic point that it's at. We don't get into those details in this episode, but again, it is our intention as part of our long-term coverage to provide listeners with all of that information. So stand by for more on that in the future. The other thing that I want to say here is that the humanitarian crisis in Sudan is simply the worst in the world, really any way you can measure it, simply by the numbers of, it's like, how do you measure human suffering, right? But simply by the numbers of people who have been displaced, are facing severe levels of food insecurity, civilian casualties, and any number of horrendous war crimes that are being committed against the civilian population of Sudan on a systemic basis.
Yeah, it cannot be understated how, simply awful the situation is, and has been over the past couple of years. The articles do a decent job of giving a sense for all that is involved there. But if you have up until now remained unaware of what is going on there, steel yourself for some brutal descriptions, because there's no other way to put it. And it highlights the fact that the people who are working on the grounds do so at their own risk. They are willingly putting themselves in that line in order to help other people. And it's our job as concerned people on the exterior to help them as best as we can.
100%. I do think that we have a moral responsibility to do something here, right? And yes, you can't do everything everywhere, but this is like the work that Andrea is doing through proximity to humanity and supporting Mutual Aid Sudan Coalition. It's not abstract. This is a direct way to help save lives on the ground. And so we encourage listeners who may be moved to do so to check that out and learn more. So as we mentioned, this is only the beginning of our coverage. Our goal, just to give you a little bit of a look behind the scenes, is to have weekly coverage, weekly episodes talking about humanitarian aid in Sudan. Because again, one of the biggest problems here is that people simply don't know about it. And so we actively are trying to change that. And to do that, again, we don't just want to give you our own opinions. We want to spotlight the voices of Sudanese aid workers and advocates and media figures. And we mean that quite literally. We want them to come on the podcast. So a little bit of a PSA, if you yourself are such a person, or if you work in the aid space and you know anyone that we should talk to, we are absolutely open to it. Please feel free to reach out to us. We have links in the description with how you can get in touch. So one of the things that you hear us discuss quite a bit in this interview are the emergency response rooms, the ERRs. And we also talk about a variation of that, the women's response rooms, WRRs, which also fulfill very critical aid needs inside Sudan. But the emergency response rooms are, and I'm quoting from Mutual Aid to Sudan here because it's important to convey this, are community-led volunteer networks that emerged in response to the conflict in Sudan, made up of Sudanese citizens, most of them young people. The ERRs organize locally to meet urgent needs when formal systems collapsed. They coordinate support across neighborhoods, regions, identifying needs, mobilizing volunteers, and delivering assistance quickly and transparently. So basically, the way to think about this is that these are, so to speak, normal people, who, from our perspective, became heroes overnight, like just turned around and asked, okay, how can we help? And they are completely responsible for sustaining aid delivery on the ground inside of Sudan. And we're talking about the most critical life-saving needs here, food, water, shelter, medicine. And so Andrea's work through Mutual Aid to Sudan and with proximity to humanity is to directly support those ERRs. Another thing that we discussed in the interview was the concept of nafir, which in Arabic means collective action, and that's really the guiding spirit of these volunteer heroes working in the ERR. And again, Andrea can speak to that far more eloquently and effectively than we can. All right, that's enough from us. There's a lot of very important baseline information that we wanted to make sure that we conveyed to you. But again, link in the description. Check out Mutual Aid to Sudan. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we bring you Andrea Tracy. Thanks so much for being here with us this morning. To kick things off, where in the world are you right now?
I am currently in Juba, South Sudan.
Awesome. And could you tell us maybe a little bit about your background in humanitarian work and how you originally became involved with humanitarian aid to Sudan?
Yeah, so I took the route of Peace Corps, went to Namibia after college, and then got involved in refugee work with an NGO and then UNHCR. So worked in refugee camps around Africa for several years. And then in 2005, I joined USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA. And actually, my first assignment in 2006 in the field was in Sudan, in Khartoum. I was managing the portfolio for the East and for the three areas. Subsequently, I went on and stayed with OFDA for a long time and did disaster work across the world, throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, being based in Bangkok, Dakar, and then various, obviously, actual disasters, either man-made or natural. And then on Sudan, after 2007, 2008, I actually left, because a friend and colleague at USAID was gunned down in his car after we had, left a New Year's Eve, celebration on the night of 2008, and I brought his body home to America and swore to myself that I would never go back to Sudan, and then carried on with work around the world because I was angry, right? I was really angry, and it was a big deal for USAID as well. Then when the revolution happened, I was working for, at that point, the Office of Transition Initiatives, and they asked me to go and do an assessment of whether or not they could set up a program to support what was then the transitional government in Sudan. And I was reluctant, of course, I was like, "Oh god, Sudan," but I went, and the feeling of hope, the inspiration was so palpable, and, it was something that it was incredible. It was incredible to be there for that time. I mean, they had so many obstacles to get through, obviously, and didn't end up succeeding, but being there and trying to support this, and we had a big budget, and we were really trying. Then in October 2021, when the coup occurred, we had to pivot all of our assistance to, civil society because we could obviously no longer work with the government. I left Sudan, 6 months before the war started, and then we can speak a bit about the ERRs later, but I ended up then working for the Special Envoy's office for Sudan, supporting partially on the humanitarian assistance as well. So it's been a sort of a long journey with Sudan, let's say.
So we wanted to talk about USAID, which you already referenced in the previous question there. And obviously one of the big things that happened last year with the Trump administration coming in was shutting it down. And I'd like to bring you back to an interview that you gave in 2025 with ABC, where you noted that as a part of the immediate fallout from the aid freeze that happened, we had around 1,500 aid kitchens in Sudan that were closed almost immediately. So obviously that's a huge number. And as a worker in Sudan at the time, could you take us back to that day? And, as someone who knows Sudan and its people, what were some of the first things that went through your mind upon hearing that news?
I mean, my immediate thought, and it was actually more like 1,700 kitchens that had to close within the span of that week, was people are going to die. And I didn't just think about Sudan in that respect. I was thinking about more globally, and we can talk about that more. But I then realized and recognized that while it was terrible, it had taken a really long time for the ERRs to develop the systems to the point where they had that much support indirectly from USAID, which was a huge, like, that they had managed to do that, a huge undertaking. So it was also really, really disappointing. And they were like, what? How is it possible that we could have done all this work to get to this point, to have 20 INGO partners and donors and whatever, to now have that all just go asunder immediately? And with all the chaos that happened with the aid cuts, NGOs had no idea which way they were coming or going. In a lot of instances, they still don't. although I think they're starting to recognize that this really is over. It was just pure chaos, and nobody had any real idea of what it all meant. So I also realized that while it was crazy, while it was chaotic, while there were so many unknowns, they had started this on their own. They had gotten support, largely from the diaspora, but otherwise on their own, and they were gonna make it work. It wasn't gonna be easy, and it wasn't gonna be pretty, but they had made it work before without any support, and they were gonna make it work again. So my feeling of people are gonna die was assuaged, at least in terms of Sudan. I would like to talk a bit about the global impacts if we have time.
Please, yeah. What is the global impact of that decision?
So I'm here in South Sudan partially to measure the impacts of these aid cuts and to look at how potentially mutual aid could be supported. But what you find is, especially in South Sudan, USAID was massive. People have grown up with USAID. People know the clinics that they go to are supported by USAID. And what we're finding now is pregnant women literally dying trying to give birth because the clinic that they counted on in a PIAM or in a county is now closed. There's no information about that. It's completely abrupt and random. And so you'll find like one hospital or one clinic now for thousands and thousands of people, and people having to walk for days sometimes to get any kind of assistance. There's no pharmaceuticals on the shelves. I mean, from a health perspective only, it's massive. And I was just in Lebanon a few weeks ago as well, looking at the response there and seeing how we could potentially support. And again, people are sort of stuck thinking, well, when there was the port explosion, there was humanitarian assistance. When there was X, Y, and Z, we thought humanitarian assistance was coming. It's not coming. It's not coming. And people are really trying to grapple with emergencies with the recognition that they're much more on their own, and the systems that used to support the work are now asunder. And that's because it's not even just humanitarian, it's all the stuff that's wrapped up around it, right? It's all the bigger USA stuff, and it's also the other cuts that were happening from government funding even before the aid cuts. So, the humanitarian sector and the development sector were both in a really bad place even before the AID cuts, and you're just finding utter collapse of infrastructure all over the place. Now we have an Ebola outbreak on the border with DRC and with Uganda. They have not even been able to get assistance or surveillance up to the border where they need to have it. Uh, I'm absolutely terrified of what this means. We do not have the systems in place to deal with this Ebola outbreak.
And do you think both in Sudan or globally, we have even begun to see the full long-term impact of these aid cuts?
Not at all, not at all. I remember immediately after they started, multiple journalists reached out saying, like, "Where should we go to see people literally dying from these aid cuts?" And I was like, "That's not quite how it works. There's wraparound services, there's a whole structure." But now, yeah, it's starting to emerge, and I think it's just gonna get so much worse. There's all these countries out there that do not have the bandwidth or the resources to support their populations. With climate change, there's more onset disasters and more conflicts, and while I understand to some degree, like, people should be responsible for their own country and for their populaces, it's just not realistic in a lot of instances, and even for the most skeptical, person around aid, USAID or otherwise, aid to people generally and tax dollars going to that, it's really the people who are suffering and had nothing to do with the fact that their government is not able to support them, and it's just been so abrupt and aggressive that yeah, people are at a loss.
And so, what about the rest of the international community in terms? I mean, I remember, the UK was also a country that cut its foreign aid budget last year, for example, in the wake of the USAID cuts. But has there been any efforts to sort of stop the gap that has been left by the USAID cuts? Has that been in any way comparable? I mean, I can obviously assume not, but has there been any signs of that?
Yeah, and I think that that was part of the calculation. Think about USAID was responsible for 40% of the overall humanitarian aid budget. Like, that's massive. And as an American, I'm like, that's too much, right? Why are my tax dollars going to that? But there is no way that no matter how much the EU or the UK or Japan or Germany want to try to shore that up, they simply don't have it themselves. They don't have it either. I mean, everyone's dealing with the fallout from Ukraine and all the other budget issues, the global financial crisis, quite frankly, and now we have Iran with the fertilizer. I mean, with the fuel, those impacts are massive. So while other donors have tried to shore up and step in, which I think was part of the calculation by those who took USAID down, while others will come in, it's just completely insufficient. And what you find are actors like MSF who are privately funded, never took a dime from the US government, are completely overwhelmed. Now they're dealing with much more severe cases, much more, much bigger population of people coming to avail of their services because in a lot of places it's turning out they're the only actor still there. So you have all these ripple effects that are crossing through the system. I will say that with our model of assistance to the ERRs, of getting support to the ERRs, which is a bit bizarre, and I think we'll talk about that. It's different to the norm. I wasn't even thinking about approaching institutional donors for at least the first year, but we were actually approached by FCDO who said, look, we want to try to do something different to get assistance directly to the ground, to let communities prioritize where assistance should go. And they've been an incredible donor. And we've seen that across the board with other institutions.
Can you bring us on the ground in Sudan, so to speak, and tell us about some of the personal responses from Sudanese ERR volunteers that when they heard that these cuts were announced?
Again, I think they were flabbergasted. I mean, they've been sort of flabbergasted by the whole aid system since entering into the fray. They've been like, so much of the nomenclature doesn't make sense. What are these sectors? What are these clusters? What is the situation with overhead? Why does everything take so long? Why is it so bureaucratic? So on some level, by the time this happened, they were a little bit inured to the shock of like, this doesn't make sense. But at the same time, like I said, they had put so much effort into it and had come to rely so much on that USAID funding indirectly that they were despondent to me. They were like, this is very bad. It's impossible. When a kitchen shutters, when an activity shutters, the community loses faith in it. And so much of it is around working with the communities. And not only that, people who are going just with one meal a day, relying on those kitchens. This is a war zone, particularly Khartoum at the time, couldn't get that one meal. So yeah, they were despondent, desperate, depressed, but also full of resolve to keep things going that they could.
So before we get into how the ERRs actually function as an aid model and save lives on the ground, uh, I want to talk about the Sudanese people who actually operate them. So, as someone who has a significant amount of experience and knowledge of the grassroots level of aid in Sudan, what do you think about on a personal human level when you think of these Sudanese volunteers? And what do you wish the world understood and knew more about them?
I think what grabs me almost on a daily level is this ethos of solidarity that they have worked so hard to maintain a non-hierarchical flat structure, to maintain equality and transparency, and to make sure that it's always the community who's taking the decisions. I've never seen, I've worked for a long time, old. I've worked for a long time. I've worked in a lot of different organizations and setups, and I've never seen such an effort to maintain something like that and for it to actually work. They are truly inspirational. They are volunteers. They are exhausted. They are working around the clock. It'll be midnight, it'll be 2 in the morning, and you get the phone calls because they've just gotten off another, round of phone calls and work that they're trying to do. I mean, it's just incredible how full of resolve and energy they are to help their people survive what they're going through. And The innovation as well has been just they've met the sector, as I was mentioning, and they said, "Okay, but this could be improved, this could be improved, this could be improved," and they've just evolved their systems from day one into something that really works, and we didn't force them to do that. They forced themselves to do that. It's been completely inspirational.
Can you can you explain to those who don't know the concept of NAFIR and how it impacts the operations and the impact of the ERR volunteers?
Yeah, it's essentially a call to action to mobilize the community. When people need support or when an entire community needs support, it's that community comes together and figures out how to do it. And it's been going on for hundreds of years. And it's not just specific to Sudan either. I mean, you even saw the fear was to form of mutual aid on some levels in Minneapolis during the ice raids. Like you're seeing it. It's been incredible sort of traveling around the world over the past couple of months, finding that same concept in communities just everywhere. It's just something that we didn't in the traditional aid sector we're not really dealing with or aware of because it's usually quite quiet. But what they've done, the ERs have taken NFIR to a whole new level now with 26,000 volunteers across the country, which is phenomenal, extraordinary.
So, in your bio on the Proximity to Humanity website, you say, and I'm quoting here, in my final 3 years at USAID, I led a program in Sudan that brought me into close partnership with grassroots activists and volunteers. When war erupted, many of them pivoted overnight into frontline responders, evacuating civilians, distributing food, repairing water systems without waiting for without waiting for funding or permission. They just acted. And I think that line, they just acted, is so telling about the grassroots response in Sudan. So I wanted to ask if you can bring us back to that moment when these volunteers first began acting and organizing in the face of significant life or death hardships. Are there any stories that you recount from those days?
I mean, I very, very clearly remember the moment like it was yesterday. I was in my kitchen in Belfast, and it was the second day of the war, and we were trying to find friends, who were on the ground in Khartoum, having to be evacuated, and the international community was leaving Khartoum, and had to obviously. It became so kinetic so quickly. And it was like, oh, now what happens in Khartoum? And interestingly, prior to the war breaking out, there was no humanitarian assistance in Khartoum. It was all relegated to conflict zones like Darfur and two areas. So while you had humanitarian aid agencies, you didn't have a active sort of humanitarian aid response in Khartoum. And so we were all like, what is going to happen? Like the entire Khartoum population can't just leave to try to find assistance elsewhere in the country. And there was this group call with a group of these volunteers who were reaching out to some international actors that they knew to say, look, we've started up these kitchens. We need to do more. We would like you to help us figure out how to get this really up and running. And I just thought, my God, like the second day of the war, they are already mobilizing. They are already saying, we are not just here. We are actors in this. This is our agency. I mean, it was truly amazing. And they've not stopped since. So yeah. And if you talk to the volunteers, even yeah, I got to travel to Darfur a couple times last year in Khartoum and meet with them on the ground. Being able to do this matters to them. Being able to contribute, being able to every morning wake up and say, okay, this is what I have in front of me to do, really, really matters a lot.
I think just because we've talked about the ERRs a lot, and obviously the strength of volunteers who make up that workforce, as it were, but it may not be a concept that everyone's familiar with concretely. So could you just give us a sort of diagrammatic layout of what ERR aid actually looks like on the ground?
I mean, it's quite different. The context of Sudan is variegated almost by the village, right? You have some parts of the country that are in the midst of Like you have some communities that are literally being besieged. Think about what happened in El Fasher before the massacre. So you've got, and then you've got in the east, where they're planting, where they're actually planting seeds and hoping for something next year, where they've got solar panels. So it's very specific to the actual community. And the way it works is through group cash transfers, typically like $5,000, something small to mitigate risk on multiple levels, including the risk of having too much money in a community. But they determine, so say I'm in a community and I determine that I want to support community kitchens. If somehow the conflict comes to me within that period of time and I decide that I need to evacuate my population, that money goes there. So it's completely flexible. And obviously there's lines around it that you can't spend money on, but they get to set the priorities from minute one to throughout the cycle of the activity. And so it really varies. Like you still have a lot of community kitchens. You also have a lot of water and sanitation activities. You've got the women's response rooms, which are adjacent to the emergency response rooms and really burgeoning into something for women and children as well. You've got informal education going on. So it's really across the board, very different and very context specific.
And what sort of role you mentioned the women's response rooms? What sort of specific needs are those teams fulfilling in the grassroots aid effort?
I mean, it's really unfortunate, but obviously the use of rape as a weapon in this war has been around since the beginning and just become immense. So women need their own space to be able to deal with that. We're dealing with pregnancies, we're dealing with unwanted children in some instances, we're dealing with specific women's needs that they don't talk about or deal with in front of men. And it's also where they can come together. What's really amazing about the women's response room is that while the ERRs maintain humanitarian neutrality, they're not political at all, and that's for obvious reasons and needs to be. They are bringing together women in southern Kordofan, in Gadaref, in Kassala, in Khartoum. People from different ethnic tribes have not met before, have never really talked, and they're talking to each other. They're actually forming these bonds and learning from each other. There's a constant sort of churning of learning. Like you'll get on a call with the ERs and there'll be 300 or 800 people on a call talking about what happened in this place and what that means for another place. So the women's response rooms hold a lot of value, but part of that value is also just the cross communication that's occurring, which is great, phenomenal. The war has unfortunately really created divides where people have to choose between SAF and RSF, and it's driven across ethnic and tribal lines, and this is purposeful on the part of the warring parties, right? This is a way to get in front of that. Like if Sudan is ever to rebuild, then the people need to be together on that, across the country.
So I wanted to dive into the actual aid model of proximity to humanity, as well as the Mutual Aid Sudan Coalition. And let's just say that there's someone listening to this interview who outside of Sudan who's hearing all that what you're talking about, hearing how catastrophic the situation in Sudan actually is, and they want to help. And they are someone with average resources, and they sign up for a $10 or $20 recurring donation. So when they hit send on that donation, how do you take that donation and turn it then into this aid on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, this was tricky, right? Because it started out quite small and has now gotten huge, frankly. Although completely insufficient to the enormity of the needs on the ground, it is a big system now, and priorities need to be set, and that communication needs to happen. So essentially, there's what they've developed called the F system, and that starts with the F1. It's a series of forms, and that's the request from the community. That's them reaching out and saying, okay, this is what we need from the base ERR level. That goes through committees, the state level, through the Central Committee, and priorities are set. And then that money is allocated. We have enough money now in the system to where when you ask for that money, it can get to you immediately, right? The money's in the system. Um, and then every 2 weeks, we do another sort of tranche of assistance based on the needs that have been submitted. It goes from F1 to F6, F6 being the monitoring and evaluation. One thing to note, throughout the humanitarian sector, I remember sitting in the meetings in Istanbul, I think in 2016 or 2017, the Global Humanitarian Summit. We made all sorts of commitments, and one of the streamlining reporting for actors, particularly in conflict zones where you don't have Wi-Fi necessarily, you don't have power, you can't get all the things that you need. But we as a humanitarian community never came through on those commitments, similar to the commitments of 25% going to localization. So they've set up this system and it's streamlined forms that are simple enough and easy enough. They've also developed a database so that everything can be tracked in real time. If a state doesn't come through with the reporting for 80% of the grants, then they're put on hold for a minute while they get the reporting in line. It's this sort of cycle that goes on and on and on. And for the 95/5 model, we didn't know if it was going to work, but we felt like we had to meet the ethos of volunteerism. So, we were all volunteers for at least the first year. And people would just write and say, hey, this is something that's happening. Can I volunteer? And I'd be like, yeah, great. It's like people across the humanitarian aid sector have lost their jobs. They're feeling like they have meaning. They were doing something that they really cared about. It wasn't just a job. It was a vocation for people. It was a calling. So all these volunteers stepped up and helped out, and now we are okay with the 95/5 model. Our overhead is very low because we don't have country offices, we don't have vehicles, we're not running around, but it's it's worked. And then one of the other commitments was obviously to move things quickly and to be as stable a source of funding as possible so that you don't have those 1,700 kitchens shuttering overnight, so that you can make plans, so that you can be strategic and not leave these massive gaps for customers and communities.
Can you just briefly explain the 95/5 model for people who may not be as aware?
It means that 95 cents of every dollar actually reaches the ground. And I'll speak to a moment last year when I was in Chad on the border with Darfur, and the El Fasher massacre was happening, and thousands and thousands of people were crossing over the border. Some who had been walking for 30 days, many who had lost family along the way, including little kids without mothers, literally dying of dehydration on the road, and or being raped and or being killed. Like it was intense. And these people were crossing over. UNHCR has something like 12% of its budget. We're losing staff right left and center, actually firing people as more people were coming over. They didn't have enough tarpaulin for shade. It was over 110 degrees. I mean, it was intense. And we made a phone call and said, hey, well, what can happen with emergency response from on this side of the border? Within 24 hours of committing something like 30,000, there were kitchens being erected throughout the desert in various places. There were water points being built on. I've never seen a humanitarian response happen that quickly. Or, I mean, frankly, like being netted out so judiciously, like it was okay. We can only have this many kitchens here, so that because people were running and people were like hadn't eaten in days. This was their first meal in days. So it was smart, and it was incredible as someone who's been on many humanitarian responses to see how quickly they managed to pull that together.
So the news cycle, of course, these days is so relentless, uh, and people are being bombarded with so much information. If they're paying attention at all, that I think for people outside of the aid space, if they hear anything about Sudan and their daily media consumption, it might be just a very quick headline, something along the lines of hundreds of thousands of people displaced in refugee camps or something to that effect, but not much else. And we want to look behind those headlines and those numbers and those statistics and hear about the actual people behind those headlines. So what is the reality like for individuals and for families in displacement camps right now?
It's hell. It's pure hell. What's interesting about having worked in refugee camps before and having worked actually with UNHCR is that I think people are not talking enough about the impacts of the aid cuts on the refugee responses globally, because USAID doesn't support refugees, right? They support internally displaced, and there's very little conversation on what's happening to state PRM, which is the body within the US government that supported refugees. Um, Here in South Sudan, I think they have a 7% of the budget they need for the camps in rank and along a wheel where the Sudanese are coming to. So you've got all these Sudanese who are leaving, don't know where to go, and ending up sometimes in worse situations than those from which they came. If you look at Kakuma camp in northern Kenya, people are having to leave because there's not enough, they can't get a meal a day at this point, and they're crossing back to South Sudan or Sudan, for instance, and again, like finding themselves without the ability to eat on a regular basis. So frankly, it used to be, okay, if you get to a camp, there's structures, there's infrastructure, you're gonna get water and food and tarpaulin and maybe even more. At this point, that is not the case. And I think people are going from one place to the next and dying along the way. We're hearing stories here in South Sudan of people who are looking for a place to be, couldn't find it, and ended up, losing a family member on the trek.
Perhaps zooming out just a little bit, when we talk about the people of Sudan themselves, is there anything that you wish the rest of the world knew that isn't being covered by the media?
It's hard because it's a war, and you see the images, if there are any images, and part of the paucity of journalism, by the way, is because of the access restrictions from both of the SAC and RSF. It's not an easy place to get to in terms of the permissions, right? But you'd see it as a war, and you might blame the people on the ground for being part of a war, being stuck in the middle of a war. But what's incredible is that the Sudanese people are some of the most gracious that I've ever come across in my decades of living around the world, being in this work. I mean, I remember being in Darfur last year, and we were sitting there and we were doing some interviews, and this man went miles away and found a cube of ice and like brought it to us and said, I got this ice, and it was such a big deal to them. I thought, my God, it just they never stop being the most gracious hosts that I've ever met. But it's also really sad because I also remember, being on the ground just by being present as a white person, as a Hawaja in Khartoum, they got excited thinking assistance is back. Okay, so what NGO are you with? Which NGO, which UN organization? And I get to be like, no, I'm sorry. So I don't think we should underestimate how important the soft power that the US government had through its assistance globally. Like, it matters. And I genuinely feel that it kept us safer. It kept us more connected to the world. And while it's taking people some time to understand, okay, maybe USAID is not coming back, now that they're starting to realize it, it's like a crushing blow. It feels like they've lost some sort of something that they really counted on and believed in.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly on the soft power points that you made. Overall, I think that people with public platforms, and significant reach and significant personal resources are simply not talking about Sudan enough. So, how can we all collectively work to change that? Not just people, of course, such as yourself, who are deeply involved with the aid effort, but let's just say normal people completely outside of the professional aid space who want to actually make a difference.
This might sound weird, but the solidarity means so much. But we will have college campuses, poets, jewelry makers reach out and say, "I want to do an event for Sudan for the emergency response rooms," and they'll organize something, and it's all around solidarity and raising money for them, and that matters. All of these acts these micro acts matter so much to the emergency response rooms and feeling less alone in what they're doing, and for the average Sudanese people. Like, the emergency response room are not just a light in Sudan, they're a light, an inspirational light globally, as far as I can tell, because it's a very difficult moment for all of us, no matter where you are. I think we're all a little bit bewildered and a little bit scared, and I think we probably should be. but but you see these folks, these volunteers, and what they're doing is so inspirational. And I have to say that an incredible thing that happened with us is that Nick Kristof, the opinion writer for the New York Times, chose the emergency response rooms as one of the 3 recipients of the Global Giving Campaign. And they saw more giving this year than they've seen in all the decades they've been running the campaign. And the checks that came in, the notes of solidarity checks, actual like physical checks, people writing checks. It'll be $100, it'll be $5. People saying, I saw Nick Kristof's letter, I saw whatever, and I want to help the people of Sudan. All of that matters. So all of these small actions that are happening make a difference. I just it makes such a difference for all of us, in shoring up society, if that makes any sense. I don't know. I'm not articulating it very well. But in this very, very dark time, the more that we can reach out to each other and understand each other's particular context, and what we're all going through, I think it really matters.
Yeah, and that Nicholas Kristof article is also how I actually became familiar with the work of the RRs. So we'll definitely link that out in the description of this episode, because I honestly think that everyone should read that piece. It has truly been an honor speaking with you today, and you've been very generous with your time. You are actually on the ground right now, helping with aid efforts. And so we're very grateful for that. This is just the beginning of our coverage on Sudan, and we plan to keep getting the word out there about the reality on the ground. So if anyone listening to this wants to help take action and save lives in Sudan, what should they do next? Where can they go?
I invite them to our website, mutualaidsudan.org. 95 cents of every dollar goes to the ground. The decisions about where the money goes and what to be done with it is all made from the people on the ground. It's done quickly, and efficiently, and I'd say, yeah, that's a good place to go.
And echoing Andrew's thanks of your time, I just wanted to round off the interview by asking you personally if you wouldn't mind sharing, all of this is obviously really heavy stuff and you're right at the heart of it. How do you look after yourself and how do you keep yourself going through all of it?
That's a really interesting question. I count myself as incredibly lucky to be able to be working with the emergency response wings, to be able to you try to explore how mutual aid can be part of the humanitarian response going forward, not just in Sudan, but globally. I feel really, really lucky to be able to continue to work at all. Like 90% of my friends and colleagues are now without work, which is just crazy. And again, I go back to, it's not because it's a job and you're looking for the income, it's because it's a vocation, it's because you care, and you want to be supporting people. So frankly, I actually consider myself as absolutely blessed to be able to do this work and to work with the emergency response rooms, because they inspire me every single day. You know?
Well, that's a great note to end on. So, Andrea, thank you so much for your time. It's really been an honor and a true pleasure talking to you. And we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate what you're doing.
This has been an episode of the St. Martin's Cloak Podcast. Today is May 18th, 2026. Thank you for listening, and stay safe.